Welcome back to our continuing series of ways I do not want to die. This week, it's cholera. And you really don't want to die of cholera. I've got to say, well, the only plus would be is it would not be a lingering death. Okay? So if you're afraid of a lingering death, and then this is the way to go. So let's jump into it here with some medical facts. And see what it is we're dealing with. My PowerPoint is not there. We go. All right. Okay. So cholera, as you may know, and I got to say the Watts chapter this week I thought was pretty good. I had some criticisms of last week's chapter on syphilis. I have even more next week's chapter, I got to say, which I don't think is very strong. So I got to give him credit here. I do think this week's chapter is pretty good, and he does talk about some of the medical side and essentially describes what it's like to die of cholera. Anyway, so I'll just be kind of brief here. So cholera is caused by a bacteria, Vibrio cholerae, and you would think that because it's caused by a bacteria, you hear bacteria, at least for me, I think antibiotics, great, right? Not that simple, all right, as we'll see here. How do you get cholera? This is a classic fecal-oral transmission. Same thing with like dysentery and other sort of diseases where the person sheds the bacteria in your stool, in your feces, usually contaminating a water source, and then somebody drinks tainted water. That's the classic fecal-oral sort of transmission. Now, if you're infected with cholera, not everybody gets drastically ill. Maybe a third of the people do. But that's enough because if you become drastically ill, it hits pretty quickly. It can be within hours or a few days. But you could wake up, drink water in the morning and be dead by night. Cramps, vomiting, watery diarrhea, and what really gets you is mostly the dehydration. And then, like I said, you can be dead within hours. Mortality rate for people who get this classic disease is about 50%. And I say 50% historically, but the fact is that's true today too. Unless, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So cholera can be a horrific disease. I mean, when cholera breaks out somewhere, there's, as with other diseases we see, there's a lot of horror involved here, right? There's a lot of emotion and emotional responses to things, as we saw with leprosy and plague and so on. But this is probably up there with plague in that way, and perhaps even more horrific because of the rapidity of it. Anyway, and a person then can stay contagious for weeks, even if they survive this initial stage here. Anyway, this is a picture of what's known as a cholera bed in a ward during a cholera outbreak, because someone who's stricken with cholera in this way, their bowels just open up, and it's almost water. Basically, all the fluid in their body drains out through their bowels, and they shrivel up, and they're a desiccated wreck and die rapidly. And so what they developed is this cholera bed, which is basically a cot with a hole in it, and you put a bucket or a pail underneath and just collect everything coming out. Obviously that's not a treatment, but that's part of the care regime here. So treatment, once again, bacteria, so you can use antibiotics, but antibiotics take time to work. And once again, you could be dead within hours. What does work, and what is probably, well, the Lancet tells us here, I've got a slide here, an incredible treatment. Probably one of the most effective treatments medicine has ever come up with is ORT. And you say, what's ORT? Oral rehydration therapy. Okay? Brings the fatality rate down to about 1%. That's incredible. From 50% down to 1%? Sign me up. Okay, so what is oral rehydration therapy? Essentially, it's also known as ORS, oral rehydration salts. It's so simple, it's brilliant. Or it's so brilliant because it's simple, I don't know. Anyway, it's these little packets, usually, which are essentially salt and sugar. That's it. I mean, look, sodium chloride, potassium chloride, they are, basically, the electrolyte kind of things you'd find in Gatorade. Except this saves your life. Okay? All you have to do is dissolve this stuff in clean water. Okay? In a liter of water and drink it. Okay? And it's enough to stabilize the fluid levels in your body, because that's the other thing with dehydration. It's not just the lack of the fluids, loss of fluids, it's a loss of those electrolytes. It's the salt and the potassium and the sugar, all the things that your body relies on at a biological level. Okay, the things you need for cell functioning, and it replaces those. And so if you can keep somebody hydrated with the oral rehydration therapy enough then to have antibiotics then have time to take effect, this saves countless lives. It's just an incredible thing. So much so, as I said here, this is a quote from The Lancet, which I don't know if you know, The Lancet is the premier British medical journal, And they say on oral rehydration solution, potentially the most important medical advance of the 20th century. That's kind of mind-blowing, okay? The journal in the field basically says this might be the most important medical advance of the whole century when you think of everything we've done in the 20th century medically and health-wise. Sugar and salt in water. But it's that effective. I just can't overemphasize that. Now, there's one problem with that, of course. You need clean water. And since this, like a lot of diseases, is born out of dirty water, that can often be a problem. There's obviously other issues involved too here, but setting up treatment facilities, getting oral rehydration therapy into places that are hit by cholera, because cholera can run wild. And the people who do this really are MSF. If you don't know MSF, that's Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders in English. And I put a link here. Actually, I'll probably put this on the agenda. You can take a look at this if you want. They literally wrote the book on managing cholera. Okay? Everything in here, from how to set up a cholera hospital, what the layout should be, how you treat people, chlorine solutions for disinfectants. It is literally a how-to guide to do this. And the fact is, with some very basic supplies, you can have a tremendous impact on control of cholera. But, and you knew there was a but coming here, but that presumes a certain level of civil or military control. And unfortunately, cholera outbreaks are notorious in situations of lack of control or chaos. Okay? Refugee situations, wars, or in the aftermath of large-scale natural disasters like the earthquake in Haiti, okay? Hurricanes, and so on. So, obviously you need that sort of civic and political and military control and some sort of infrastructure in place before you can start doing this. And those are the things that oftentimes are lacking in these situations. Anyway, there have been, scholars look at 7 pandemics of cholera throughout history. Well, no, throughout the last 200 years anyway. And we don't know much about cholera before that. As Watts tells you, he talks about the start in India and so on. Where was it before that? We don't know. It's not showing up so much in the historical record. of these numbered pandemics, then we've got once again the first one starting in about 1817, 1824 in India, and then spread from there, well, throughout large parts of the world, except for, well, pretty much every place except the Americas. The second epidemic, once again, India, spreads to Russia, Finland, and then to the Americas. The third in the 1850s, once again, epidemic in India, spreads to Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. And that's going to be the epidemic of John Snow. Fourth epidemic, once again, in India. Actually, all of these are in India except for the seventh, which begins in Indonesia. Spreads to Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Italy. Subsequent outbreaks occurring in Japan, South and Central America, Africa, and most recently, Haiti and Yemen. And I gave you that news story from CNN to read that talks about the most recent outbreak in Haiti. Yemen would be another case where they're also experiencing a civil war. So once again, civil unrest, military conflict leads to the conditions that spread cholera. As Watts talks about certain things in England, but you had, for example, 1831 to 33, you had a cholera outbreak in England, killed thousands of people just in London, okay? And that sparks what are known as the cholera riots. There were actual riots in 1832. Why would there be riots over cholera? Well, it's indirectly about cholera, but see, cholera is like any other disease. You should be familiar with this at this point, that when these things break out, as we saw with leprosy, right? Or even construct leprosy or perceived leprosy, people take this as a sign of societal breakdown, right? And especially in those cases where they lose control, they're also looking for someone to blame. That's kind of what happens here. The public perception was that cholera victims were being removed to the hospital to be killed by doctors so they could use them for anatomical dissection. This is during the whole era of grave robbing and so on. The mobs roaming the streets in Liverpool. And it's not an idle concern. 1826. They discovered 33 bodies on the docks in Liverpool. They were being shipped to Scotland for dissection because a local doctor had organized this grave robbing system. Basically you pay the guys who are digging the graves or putting people on the ground to turn around and dig them up so they can use them for anatomical study. So it's not a totally implausible concern here, but it gets wrapped up in this loss of control, I think, and so on over this disease. Anyway, so back then, so we have several outbreaks once again in England. Let's see, the 1831, that must have been the second outbreak. Yeah, that's during the second global pandemic. And then the third global pandemic as it reaches England is where we have John Snow introduced here. And that outbreak then kills 12,000 people in London, and that's when Dr. John Snow steps in. And if you haven't already, this is a good time. Take a break, go watch that short video about John Snow and the Broad Street Pump in London. And as you do, you pay attention to the fact that John Snow is not only one of the founders of bacteriology, but also of anesthesiology. Basically, one of the founders of two of the major fields of medicine today. So, I don't know about you, but I reflect on that and I'm like, what am I doing with my life? Anyway, okay, go watch the video on John Snow. Come back in a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to assume you watched that, and it's inspiring stuff, right? The thing about cholera is actually we have two major medical kind of advances surrounding cholera. One is this John Snow episode and the sort of initial linkage of a disease and a route of transmission. But the other one is Robert Koch, or Koch. Now, we saw that, we read about him before. He's in the Porter book, but you also in the Garrett reading for last week. I'm looking over the bookshelf so I can remember. The Garrett reading last week, she talks about Koch's postulates, right? And she talked about these rules for how to determine if a specific organism causes a specific disease. Now, if you don't remember that, or you don't know Koch's postulates very well, I put a link on the agenda to a very short video. It's like 4.5 minutes or something, of a biology professor explaining what these are. It's a good video, and it's a very good video also because she talks about some problems with them too, and where we can't always match up to this ideal of Koch's postulates. So, if you didn't, you can watch it now. Pause me. Okay, if you don't want to pause me, you can watch it later anyway. But I started to say, so Koch then was the one who links the causative organism, the bacterium, to the actual disease, which he does in 1884 in India. And once again, reflecting on, what I'm not doing with my life, Koch not only discovers the linkage between this bacterium and cholera, he also identifies the causative organism for tuberculosis and the causative organism for anthrax. So, why do I even bother, right? Okay, so these, there's some pretty, incredible developments here related to cholera then. And because he worked in the latter part of the 19th century, we've got a picture. That's him at the microscope right there. This is probably posed, but that's him and a colleague in India looking at the Vibrio cholerae bacterium through the microscope. So there we go. It looks like a smart guy, right? Okay, and the other guy, love the mustache. These 1880s Germans. And they're both German here. Anyway, okay. Now, just because we have antibiotics, just because we have oral rehydration therapy, doesn't mean cholera is done. Okay? It also has, it can live in water. It can live in a natural environment. This is what we saw with plague also, right? Plague can have a natural reservoir in animals, but it can also survive in the soil. Well, cholera can just survive in water too. So we're not really sure about the natural history of cholera yet. Anyway, but we've had a major outbreak fairly recently, 2017, 2018, where we see once again, of course, Haiti being a major country here, 800,000 cases, 800,000 cases. Other countries, once again, there's Yemen there with 1 million cases of cholera. That's pretty incredible, right? And I can go through and you can see, a number of these places. Well, the fact is, Sudan and South Sudan were, involved in a civil war. Democratic Republic of Congo basically has no functioning central government. But some of these other places are pretty stable. Tanzania in 2017, 2018, pretty stable. Kenya was, Uganda. So, part of this is probably refugees from the surrounding places that come in here. Because obviously there's 63,000 and there's 2,000 here. So that's obviously a much smaller number. So they're probably looking at these countries, Somalia, as you might imagine, Ethiopia, DRC, of unrest, and then refugees, immigrants move to safer places and bring the disease with them. Anyway, so as I said, it's cholera is certainly not done yet. The 7th pandemic that I identified for you that's going on basically from 1961 onward, my entire life really, has affected these countries around the world. which is a significant portion of the world here. Um, so, uh, we're not looking at polio here, where that's on the burn. There was natural polio eliminated, right? Um, or not polio. Sorry, I mean smallpox. Smallpox is eliminated. Polio almost, but not quite. Um, so, due to the route of transmission, due to the fact that it lives in water, it's a very hard thing to get a control on, even with antibiotics and ORT. Anyway, so not to end on a depressing note, but I guess I'm going to end on a depressing note. Okay. So please read Watts pretty carefully. I think this is, as I said, I think this is a pretty good chapter, and I've asked a couple questions for you to mull over and post about in the discussion board. All right. Thank you very much.